This passage is about the insurrection, the kind of rebellion, violence that happened in the US Capitol. Actually, the attack on the US Capitol building or the legislature building. He hasn't mentioned exactly that, he just mentions the word insurrection. The author mentions how it happened, how people were persuaded, were instigated by false news and to react with violence, and how one can ignore or look, how one can recognize false news, how what should the conditioning of a person be. He basically says when you read fiction, you know how an author builds a story, maybe truth but with fictional parts attached to it, how a good reader of fiction can find out the nuances of false stories and false news. So we'll read the passage quickly and summarize it, and then we'll look at the questions. In the US, we're feeling the sickening after effects of an attempted insurrection committed by people, many of whom before that day had never acted against their country or shown the least sign of being violent. We're talking of that one act of violence going against the country by people who'd never acted against their country, who'd never been violent. What's happening over here? Good question. The truth is, nobody knows. But here's one way of looking at it. These people were told a false story and acted on it with a level of passion and violence that would suggest true belief. So they were told a false story, but they believed and acted on it. They acted on it believing their action makes us believe that they thought that false story was true. They believed it. That false story, a set of false stories really bundled together, came to them via their news feeds and radio talk shows and partisan television shows with an alluring high-tech gleam. So how did they receive these stories? Through all these channels, right? News feeds, radio shows, TV shows, with all the high-tech involved in the glamour. In the face of this onslaught, their story receptors provided inadequate to the movement. You have story receptors, your mind proved inadequate to the moment, and they exhibited a failure of what Hemingway calls one's built-in shock-proof shit detector. We all have a built-in shock-proof detector of false news, but that day it failed for all these people. When they received the false news, they could not detect it, and therefore they acted on it violently. The stories these people fell for were laced with agenda, told with profit, designed to agitate, titillate, divide, and antagonize, thrown together quickly, misshapen by the demands of the delivery vehicle, which limited the number of characters used or prioritized likes and shares. So basically, this is we talking of social media, Twitter and WhatsApp and Facebook, maybe. The stories were laced with agenda. So there was an underlying agenda. There was a purpose to sending these stories. They were told for profit. They were designed to instigate people to rouse them to activity, and they were put together quickly because of the constraints of the number of characters you can use. They were misshapen, they were twisted, they were contorted, right, by the demands of the delivery vehicle. These stories entered the minds of their audience the way any story does, and their audience processed them earnestly as if there was something vital to learn in them, because that's what our minds do. So when we were told these stories, the people who reacted to it, they received it. They received it in the way anybody would react or receive a story. There are signs in a false story, tells we might call them, slight hitches in the language or logic of the story that someone versed in reading fiction comes to recognize. If you are versed, if you are used to reading fiction, you can see the hitches in the language. You can see the small changes in the language which will enable you to know the signs of a false story. We convinced by a passage in a story or not. By that, we learn that language comes especially alive when truthful. So you are convinced by a story or not convinced by a story, by the language. If that language speaks the truth to you, then it comes across. You're convinced by it. Our minds learn to sense when a narrative is in harmony with the actual and when it isn't. So our mind knows when a narrative is in harmony with the actual, with what is truth, and when it is not. Tom ran across the fresh cut grass, which smelled as all fresh cut grass smells of kerosene. Strikes us as false. Fresh cut glass doesn't smell as kerosene, like kerosene. This, written by Tolstoy, about two men riding through a blizzard in a horse drawn sled, strikes us as true. What is that? The snow was falling from above, sometimes rose from below. The horse was evidently exhausted. His hair had all curled up from sweat and was covered with hoarfrost, and he went at a walk. See the vivid description. There was snow everywhere, the horse was cold, the horse was wet, and it just couldn't move. Therefore it was not it was going at the pace of a walk. This resonates the truth with us rather than the passage on the statement on the grass smelling like kerosene, which is ridiculous. That rising of the heart to that second example is the feeling of one's bullshit detector being tuned. You know where the true story is, you know where it is. Who am I? Everybody. That is the idea on which fiction is built. You can relate to the story. You can relate to the characters of a story. I am everyone. Who am I? I am everyone. And that is the basis of fiction. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way to head off future insurrections, the way to prevent future insurrections, is to require all citizens to read classic short stories. So he's saying, I'm not saying that all citizens should read classic short stories. That's not what I'm saying. Not everyone is susceptible to fiction's charms. Not everyone likes to read fiction. And anyway, people have been reading literature before, during, and after every catastrophic period of history. And readers of literature have at times been leading the mayhem. So he says, I'm not saying that reading short stories, classical short stories, is the way to prevent insurrections. In fact, he says that readers of literature, people have been reading literature before, during, and after catastrophic events. And in some cases, readers have led the chaos during any insurrection. Yet, in this beautiful essay, This Is Water, David Foster Wallace talked about the power of choosing to subvert or interrupt our default settings. So there's this famous book, beautiful essay called This Is Water by David Foster Wallace, where he says, you can subvert, change, or interrupt our default settings on what to accept, what aligns with the truth and what doesn't. About consciously transforming our internal narratives regarding annoying people around us, those in those cars in that checkout line. So how we can change our internal narratives about people who irritate us. What went unstated? So in this essay, David Wallace Foster said this, but what went unstated but was implied in the passage is that immersion in art can be a way of training ourselves to enact this interruption of our default settings. If you're immersed in art, you can interrupt your default settings. You can change the narrative. You can change. This is the ending of the passage. Okay. All right. We cannot infer all of the following about false news from the passage except. Can't infer all except means which one can we infer from among the following statements. Our built-in instinct for false news is shock-proof and can never be subverted. Then what happened in the case of the insurrection in the US? If it is shock-proof, false news proof, it can never be subverted. What happened to the people there? Their system was subverted. They believed in the false news, right? So author didn't say that. He says we have an inbuilt system. That is true. But he didn't call it shock-proof and can never be subverted. The second part of the option is wrong. If false news is attractively packaged and told repeatedly, it will be believed by most. Has he said that? In the case of the US, those people believed in it because it was attractively packaged, it was given like this, it was given like that. And they took in the story. But has he generalized it and said most people will believe that? He hasn't said that. So we cannot infer that. David Wallace's essay stated that immersion in art can help alert us to recognize false news. Sounds very close to the correct answer, but we need to go back. Whenever they ask something which makes you think, yeah, something rings a bell. I know he said this, he said about being immersed in art. Cross check, because they like to play with words. Maybe David Wallace's essay said something else, and the option said he stated that immersion in art can help alert us to recognize false news. Let's check it. But let's read D as well. False news can be threaded with a certain underlying plan. You can create false news and go through it when you have an underlying plan, which is what the people did during the insurrection in the capital. So C and D both look right. Now, which one are we going to choose? Let's quickly go to David Wallace's essay. In his beautiful essay, This is Water, David Foster Wallace talked about the power of choosing to subvert or interrupt our default settings, about consciously transforming our internal narratives regarding the annoying people around us. What went unstated in that piece, though strongly implied? So, David Foster Wallace did not state this last line, which has been given in the option. Immersion in art can be a way of training ourselves to bring this change in our default settings. This was implied by David. It was not stated. Therefore, that's her right answer. And the other part, of course, is that we do have an inbuilt false news can be threaded with a certain underlying plan. Yes, this has been given. I'll just underline the line so that you know exactly where it has been given. The stories these people fell for were laced with agenda. That means you can spread stories when it is laced with agenda, when it has an underlying theme or purpose to it. That is my aim. I want people to do this. I want people to believe this and act against the government. That's my agenda. I want to create chaos in society. That is my purpose. So I'm going to send false stories. There's a purpose behind. I'm just randomly not sending it because I'm bored. So therefore, from that we can infer D is correct, right? Therefore, D is our correct answer.